Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you on the ship. Welcome aboard. And as Gary says, I do have a U.S. Coast Guard Merchant Marine Officer's license, and my little ship is actually in a dry dock near Barcelona. But I promise to stay on board here until my other ship is ready. It's actually a three-masted sail ship. I'm actually a tall ship captain. And so I'm bearing with the comfort of this ship somehow. But I've been sailing around the world most of my life. I worked 9 years for Lindblad Travel at the ends of the world. And then I've been coming to Europe and around the Mediterranean quite a bit. And today I'm going to talk about Gibraltar, which is, of course, a great icon of history. And if you have sailed past it, as some have said they've done, you haven't had a chance to actually stop there. It's really quite a rich place of human experience, for better and for worse. Now today, since we were in Portimao here, and I imagine some of you went ashore or maybe had a tour, but this was the first day of rain we've had in weeks, which is just to give you a longer rest aboard. I suppose if you didn't go in and see the little town, but I was asked to actually give an introduction to it for those of you who didn't go ashore or would like to know a little bit more about it, because we're coming right up to Gibraltar, and Portimao is the last Portuguese port before we entered the Great Gate into the Mediterranean. And so just to show you, we are on the Algarve, the southern coast of Portugal, which I'm sure you may have visited all its beautiful towns and beaches, quite far from the metropolitan area of Lisbon. But it features these tremendous limestone cliffs that are dotted along the shore here. And actually, Gibraltar is similarly a limestone uplift, which made for the dramatic rock. But if you come here on a holiday to one of the towns, you'll see back countryside. They have this is called a Mejir, which is a prehistoric stone marker, of which there have been many found throughout the countryside of Portugal up to the north coast of Spain, Brittany, and then even into the British Isles with Stonehenge and others. So this is an evidence that people have been here well before our written history. And curiously, it does look like the coast a bit with the big rocks. Well, this is Portimao, the flag of the town, the Portuguese town. And like many here, they have a castle, and then they have a Portuguese fellow, and then a Moor, who, of course, used to rule this land. All these areas where we have been conquered over and over again. And now it is Portuguese, but the Moors are very much a strong presence, and there's still an Islamic heritage here, which particularly you can see in Gibraltar. So here's just the city of Portimao. Again, a Castillo, which was San Andres. We missed that one. This is the port. If you went in there, you saw it's kind of a broad, sheltered port, and then it's a gateway to what has now become a large holiday development because of its weather, other than today, and the beautiful beaches that are all through this area. So if you come back, you can have a beautiful ocean view of this ship if you stay ashore. And there's a lot of modern shopping. This is, of course, Portugal used to be a very poor and, let's say, underdeveloped country. Now it is, ever since it joined the EU, it has developed quite rapidly and is now a major tourist area, just like the south coast of Spain. This is the fortress that overlooks the harbor, if anybody went there the other day. One, like many, built by the Portuguese as they slowly made the Reconquista and drove the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. The last place to fall was Granada and Gibraltar. But the Portuguese, of course, were famous in this area for shipbuilding, and Portimao and others were traditional ports for constructing the caravels that end up going around the world. Now there's a remnant fishing fleet, though much of the ocean is fished out. But even on the river here, up into Portimao, there's a shipyard that builds caravels in the style of the 1500s, which was the heritage of this area, and then that launched Portugal to go around the world and have these seaworthy little ships, which were deep-hulled, and they had a caravel hull that could take stronger waters, and then they built their empire around the world right out of these ports where we are. Some of you may take the excursion to Lagos, which is the old city that, again, was a shipbuilding center. And Nowadays, it's mostly a tourist area because of, again, the beautiful waters and beaches. But curiously, if you were there, this is the slave market, which dates from 1444 and is still there as a historic monument. But notice it's been turned into boutiques and restaurants instead. But the Portuguese started the African slave trade, but they also said that they were among the first to end it in 1836. And Queen Maria Braganza, at the time, the royal family their major business was slave trading from Africa to the Americas. And just as a bit of note, I live in New York State, and when the county of Queens, New York City, the Portuguese community wanted to build a statue to Queen Maria and place it somewhere in Queens, New York, someone got into the history book and said that she was a slave trader, therefore this was politically incorrect. Well, they put it in somebody's backyard instead. Anyway, just a local story. The other city right near here, if you went on the excursion there, is Silves. And that has the most complete Moorish castle left in all of Portugal. So it's still in good tact. They actually surrendered without a great bombardment and a sacking of the city. So it has the cathedral and the towns and the river and the beaches nearby. But that castle itself is a historic monument because it still has its crenellations and towers and everything. And they've been excavating parts of it and found parts of it that are from the Visigoth era, and that's post-Roman, pre-Moorish. Here's a Visigoth capital off of an old column. So this was once a very elegant castle, sort of like Alhambra, and if you get to go there in Spain, that's still, again, a Moorish, beautiful palace and fortresses that are still intact with these kind of arches. This was the Portuguese warrior and king, King Sancho I, who came from Lisbon with his armies and finally drove the Moors out of Silves in this part of Portugal and also defined the border with Spain, which were competing kingdoms at the time. As you were in Lisbon, and you may have seen this great monument to the Portuguese explorers, that is Henry the Navigator, who was the second son of King João II, who then set up his school of navigation and trained navigators and seamen to go on their great explorations around the world. At Sagres, which is just to the west of here, it's a point of land out on the Atlantic, he had his Academy of Navigation, which has this great, up the upper left-hand side, you can see his great compass rose, which is still there. Most of the buildings have crumbled in the rough weather that point gets. But from there, the Portuguese went out into the world, into an ocean that they did not know, and went around the world and set up colonies. And there's a saying in Portuguese, we have a small country to be born in, but a great world to die in. And many of them went out, of course, never came back. But this is an illustration of the period where it's hard to read all of the curiosities of the illustrations, but notice that the mast has been broken. So this particular navigator is being guided by divine intervention. And here's another curious illustration of the Portuguese out. There's the navigator with his astrolabe, and then various curious sea creatures, including, I'm not sure what the big bird holding an elephant means, except that's obviously he's going to Africa. Well, the Portuguese were remarkable in their little ships coming right out of Portimao and Lisboa and Lagos. They sailed all the way around Africa. It took them many decades before they rounded Cape Hope. And here's an illustration of Pedro Diaz when he arrived in 1482 off the Great Table Mountain. And it was so stormy that he came back all the way to Portugal, and he called it the Cape of Storms. But the king at the time said, nobody will go back if you say it's so rough down there. If you've been down there, it's a very rough sea, of course. He said, better to call it the Cape of Good Hope so more people will go. And so there's where the name comes to this day. Well, the Portuguese continued all the way around Africa and then up the east coast to Mombasa, then across to Calicut on the Malabar coast. And then their empire spread for the years out across Asia to the point where they had Goa, Macau, Malacca, and their last port of call in their own trading network was Nagasaki, Japan. So these few people from this small country were the leaders for world exploration. And then by the early 1500s, they had colonies, or at least trading posts, all around Africa. They also had, with Cabral, claimed the coast of Brazil, and they had the red dots, or different trading posts. Because there were so few Portuguese, they did not occupy or send colonists. They were just traders with their navy and army there to protect their trading interests. At first in great competition with the Spanish, and the story of Magellan's voyage is a Portuguese who turns traitor and is in the employ of King Charles V of Spain to beat the Portuguese to the Spice Islands on the other side of the world. That's a grand story for another day. But when in 1540 the crown of Spain and Portugal were merged, that led to a period of about 80 years where the Spanish Empire, including Portugal, was the world's first great maritime empire, with all of the colonies in the Americas, in Africa, and Asia. And when you're in Portugal and Spain, you can almost feel the echo of this glorious time which enriched Portugal and Spain. If you go to Seville, you see the cathedrals full of American native gold, and then the treasures from Asia came all the way back to Portugal and Spain, leading to rivalry with the Europeans. In short, it was a point of time in the world which did not last for long because of the competition of other European nations. Well, and Gibraltar was right at the center of that. So here's the great strait leading into the Mediterranean as you look to the east here. And you can see how close Africa and the Iberian Peninsula are. It's only 27 kilometers, about 15 miles across. And when we sail into Gibraltar, you can see Africa on the other side of the strait. Now, this was of historic consequences for many, many centuries. So here we have Gibraltar's on the east side of the strait. Tarifa, Algeciras are the Spanish towns. Now, we are off the map up to the upper left-hand side. And then there's Morocco. Tangier, if you've been there. Ceuta is a little peninsula that is Spanish occupied. And there's another little island further off the map to the east that is Melilla, which is also Spanish occupied. And this dates from the Reconquista, when the Portuguese and then the Spanish wanted to actually conquer Morocco and the North African coast. And that's a whole other story. But they have held on to a few little bits of land, and that's actually of some consequence. So every time that Spain makes complaint about Britain holding Gibraltar, well, the Moroccans and others say, well, then you have to give back your possessions in Africa. Ceuta, how about throw in the Canary Islands? So this kind of dispute goes on and on. But I'll just show you more of just Gibraltar, because it's a remarkable sight. Now, this giant rock is actually a limestone uplift that has precariously held the gates to the Mediterranean for geological time. And it had many residents, from Neanderthals to Phoenicians to Moors, Spanish, English, everybody. Now it's a very mixed community that lives there. But what it has done is spilled out on the west side. All of that landfill dockage has made it a modest-sized territory with only about 120,000 people in it. But they're all crammed together on that side because the rock itself is not really habitable. It's so steep. And though you can see on the right-hand side of the rock, that is an artificial wall to catch water, for water supply for the growing population. And it's all, that rock is honeycombed with caves, some natural, like St. Michael's Cave, but there are many military installations all through it. And through the centuries, gun emplacements have been put all through the mountains. Now they're mostly dismantled. But you can see on the north side of the rock, in Spanish land, there's a whole other sprawling city, San Rosas, which is many of the people who live there actually commute into Gibraltar to work in the shipyards or in the services industries of Gibraltar now. So as we approach, here's a pilot boat coming out and seeing us another day. And can you hear? Oh, there we are, Ken. Past Point Europe, or Punta Europa. That is the southernmost point of all of the European territory. I think Malta claims to be a little further south, but either way, this certainly feels like the end of the European continent down here. And just across is Morocco, with the tip of the great mountainous ranges of Morocco. It's not really part of the Atlas Mountains, but it's Mount Abila, and that is considered the other pillar of Hercules. So in ancient times, navigators would come in the wider Mediterranean, they'd come up and see two giant mountains. So that's why it got the name, the Pillars of Hercules here. Well, nowadays it's so close that, there's a lot of, first of all, ferry traffic, trading, but it's very tightly controlled. And for, again, thousands of years, people have been coming across from Africa to Europe this way. I took this picture, it says, mind your step, or sort of like mind the gap between Europe and Africa. Now, the first people that probably came were proto-humans. This is called Our Lady of Gibraltar, who was a Neanderthal who lived here over 20,000 years ago in one of the caves on the east side of the rock. And they believe that the Neanderthals, as they were competing with the Homo sapiens, or whatever we call ourselves, they could not compete, and the last of them ended up living in Gibraltar. Then came the Phoenicians, who set up a trading post here back about 1500 BC. So this has been well known and well traveled all in historic times. And then the Greeks call this, again, the Pillars of Hercules, and there's Hercules himself, not a shy fellow. And he supposedly went up to found the city of La Coruña in northern Spain. So he had, in his legendary travels, he had 10 great tasks, the last of which, to prove his superhuman strength, was to break through the stone that held the Mediterranean apart from the Atlantic Ocean and created a big flood. Well, actually, geologically it happened, but it happened about 50 million years ago when the Mediterranean had dried out. It was a salt basin like the Dead Sea, and at one point, as the seas rose, it broke through and made the Strait of Gibraltar. But in sort of prehistorical memory, maybe it was passed out as a tale and became this tale of Hercules. Well, this is a Roman map of the area. Now, the double column represents the mountains and the Pillars of Hercules, and this is somewhat inaccurate just because it's not geologically correct, but that is the earliest map that shows Gibraltar. Then the history goes on with the battles of the Visigoths and the Moors but in Gibraltar there's the last remnant of the Moorish castle, which is the gateway to the higher embankments of the of the rock, and that dates from about 1300. And you can go up and see it. It's in fairly good condition, not quite as complete as the Moorish castle in Silves, but in it and also in some other parts of the town in Gibraltar, there are still Moorish remnants like the baths that are at the museum. This was the symbol and charter for Gibraltar given by Queen Isabella in 1502 when she, with her newly unified Spanish kingdom, decided that Gibraltar was an important outpost. So that has still been the symbol of Gibraltar to this day. It's on the flag. So it's Montes Insignia Montes Calpe, which means the hollow mountain, which it actually is. It does have caves, and it's a hollow hill in many, many ways. Later, the Habsburg King Charles V built this wall around the old town just to keep out the pirates. Now, this is a very long, complicated history from here on because so many people were competing for Gibraltar. Every generation there was a battle or so. The rock had over 14 major bombardment sieges, and so there's remnants of fortifications all through the area. But there had been very few inhabitants because it's all slopes back then before the landfill. They actually had to pay people to live there, to garrison it. And then at one point the Spanish crown sent convicts instead of a prison. They got to be garrisoned at Gibraltar. So this is what it looked like when it was a simpler place, let's say, 1782. This is already, the British were there, but it had not yet been built up as a large fortress, and even the English crown was not too eager to have this initially. It was very inhospitable. It was subject to, first of all, isolation and lack of food if it was surrounded. It could not grow its own food. It had to have friendly relations. And curiously, the Moroccans were always allied with the English versus the Spanish to help supply. And it became a major smuggling center for many decades. And so if you go into the town, it still looks somewhat like this in parts, little medieval lanes and towers, and now it has some official buildings. That's the remains of the Moorish fort there on the height. But then the military history sort of took full lead on it. Now, when we go into the dock, you'll see there's a panorama of military history right as we get off the ship, also a model of the geology. And so this is various marines of different eras that are there. It was the Anglo-Dutch alliance in the War of Succession, trying to back Charles VI, the Habsburg king, to be king of Spain, that led to an attack on the other Spanish fleet that took Gibraltar. And this went on in the long history of the wars there. 1704 is when the British finally occupied it. And then by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, it was given by that treaty forever without any exception or impediment whatsoever in Article 10 of that particular treaty. Now, later the British Crown tried to trade it for islands in the Caribbean, thinking they could grow sugarcane to be more profitable. So there's always been a kind of an uneasy feeling about having Gibraltar, except because it was uninhabitable in many ways. Had to be supplied by sea, subject to sieges, but over time it proved its strategic worth. So slowly there were docks and fortifications built around the rock. This is 1799. And curiously, when the British insisted that they would keep it because it was the gateway to the Mediterranean, both the French and the Spanish crown were protesting at that time, leading them to support the American rebels in the American Revolution. And so this is where even Gibraltar had a little impact on that particular battle. This is Sir John Rooke, who led the Navy during the combined Spanish-French siege of Gibraltar, which lasted over 3 years. This was the longest siege in British military history. And this particular illustration is when Sir Rooke led a foray out to attack the Spanish lines, which had surrounded the flatlands around the rock. And you'll read about this or hear about it when we're there, but the Spanish built bombardment barges, which had heavy timbering on them and then gun emplacements. They came up close and were bombarding the fortifications at Gibraltar, and in return, the defenders heated their cannonballs on big open fires and shot them hot onto the bombardment barges, catching them all on fire, blowing them up. Some 700 Spanish sailors who were in this terrible duty were lost right there off of what is the harbor there by that particular action. Well, it went on. There were more attacks, more defenses, and so this is sort of a terrible history. But then it came down to this fellow, Napoleon, who in this illustration is said, "Oh, who dares interrupt my progress?" It says, "'Tis I, little Johnny Bull, protecting a little spot. I clap my hand, and damn me if you come any farther." That's it. So, at this time, Napoleon had taken all the European continent, but it was being surrounded by the Royal Navy that bottled up the French fleet, and then Gibraltar was also held in the last desperate move to keep Napoleon from taking over the world, let's say. This was his plan to invade under the English Channel and across it to invade England, but he made a tactical mistake just like Hitler did later. He decided to invade Russia because it was easier. Well, anyway, here is the hero of that era. You know much about him, I'm sure, Lord Nelson, who was stationed at Gibraltar and then was on the patrol in the Mediterranean and then around the west coast of Spain. And he gathered his fleet to defend against any running of the blockade by the French and Spanish, who were allied at this time. And he was famous for his touch, which meant he would encourage his officers to make their own independent judgments. And in battle, don't wait for command, just go for what you need to do. And this is the illustration where he said, England expects every man to do his duty. Now this is much lauded, but this battle happened right off of Gibraltar and Cadiz, so within 100 miles from here, sea miles. And in short, Nelson led his fleet, rather than lining up and having bombardment, he went in the line, broke the line, and had close-up combat, and won the day with very few losses on the on the British side, but a devastating defeat for the Spanish and French fleet there, including they had to rescue as many people as they could off of the sinking Spanish ships. Well, the tragedy is that a sniper, French sniper, saw Nelson in his uniform and killed him on deck, and he died below, if you know the detail of the story. But then his ship, the Victory, was brought back to Gibraltar. He was put in a cask of brandy, taken back to England, where the Victory is still there. And the old story is that the cask of brandy was empty when they took it offshore at Portsmouth, because the sailors got in to have a drink of the admiral's blood. Anyway, it's a bit of history again that is very much related to Gibraltar, because control of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean for the Royal Navy meant that the British had supremacy of the seas for a couple of centuries thereafter. Napoleon was on his way to defeat, and the empires of the French and Spanish started getting parceled up or became independent. Particularly the sale of Louisiana to the United States was a consequence of Napoleon's desperation. The Monroe Doctrine was in cooperation with Britain, and the U.S. didn't interfere with, let's say, British colonial plans in other places. And then I say that's the root of the Anglo-American alliance after all the troubles of the Revolution, and there were troubles after that, but it led to the Atlantic Charter and the community of principle that led to the founding of the United Nations, in short. And also a certain amount of humanity after victory, which Nelson promoted, that you do not kill your prisoners, you do care for the people, you do not attack civilians, things like this, that became the Geneva Convention. And this led to our defense of freedom for oppressed people that goes on to this day. So you could say this comes back to the leadership of this man at Gibraltar. And his uniform's on display at the Historical Museum. That's a copy of the originals in Greenwich, England, of course. But if you climb up above the main town, you can go to the Royal Navy Cemetery, which has many from many of these conflicts, and you can read the epitaphs of certain of them that are there. But on the side of it, I found this inscription. Says, "God and the soldier all men adore in time of trouble and no more. For when war is over and all things righted, God is neglected and the old soldier is slighted." Well, that remains to be a problem, so you might see this in the terminal coming out in Gibraltar. Well, the troubles went on. This happens to be the American Navy coming in 1909 in a show of the Great White Fleet that went around the world. Then World War I came through, and that was where Gibraltar proved its strategic value, because the German fleet could not get out of the Mediterranean because of the fortifications at Gibraltar. And there were some skirmishes and submarines sort of changed it, but the fortifications from that era are still visible, particularly on the south end of the island, where they could shoot far enough to close the whole strait. Then in World War II, great fleets assembled in the Bay of Gibraltar and then went on to the battles in the Mediterranean. But curiously, because of the nature of the water, the very saline Mediterranean water comes and slips over sill and has a counterflow to the surface water, which is flowing into the Mediterranean. And this led the U-boats to be able to ride silently on those undersea currents without having to surface or run their engines, so they could slip past Gibraltar. Then there were the air wars. Now, Spain stayed neutral under the threat of invasion from the Allies, but Gibraltar was bombed many times, and so this is an example of the searchlights and anti-aircraft, and then there was an air base that fought back, but Gibraltar was never taken yet again. But the residents were evacuated because of the difficulty of living there in this war conditions. So you'll see around the town there are some of the guns left, but it's mainly a Navy town. Here's one of the great mooring anchors, and the Royal Navy is still there, though on a much diminished scale. And there are docks, and now they've been turned over to transshipment. Algeciras, the Spanish town right across the bay, is the third largest port in Europe, so you'll see lots of ships, but only a few of them put in at Gibraltar because there's no space to handle cargo. The Spanish had closed the border in protest of the continued British presence for many years. In 1977, when the gates were closed, there was no military action, but curiously, during the Falklands War, Argentine commandos came to Spain and were planning to attack the Royal Navy in the harbor. But the Spanish Secret Service arrested them, saying, if you do that, then we're in trouble too. So that was the last military action that happened in Gibraltar. Well, nowadays it's become a completely different place. Ships like this one come in, and they're good services, and it's become a service area with banking, online gambling, and I think that polite industry called tax sheltering is the major business in Gibraltar now. Now, this is a very small place, but it has the second highest per capita income in all of Europe. Anybody want to guess the first? Monaco. Well, you'll see, we're only going to the most fancy places, I guess. Well, anyway, now if you come in off the dock, you can actually walk from the ship into town maybe for 10 minutes, but otherwise the buses will come in and you'll go a couple of roundabouts, come up to the old casement walls and the batteries. Now that's just historic preservation. There's no defense against tourism, as we all know. And then there's a lot of new building everywhere, and high-rises and offshore investment in property. And so you come up to just a bus station that's often around the walls. They've kept them all, which is to the credit. And you have to go through one of the traditional gates to get into the town of Gibraltar. And so this is a little disconcerting if you feel like you're going to a tax-free zone. You still have to walk into a fortress to do it. And so the historic preservation in Gibraltar is actually quite well done because this tremendous history is quite palpable, especially in the architecture. So here's the main gate coming into the Casement Square, it's called, which used to be where troops would assemble, and then there were artillery up on the walls, and it was a military zone, but now it's been given over just to a plaza with cafes and shops. And it's quite peaceful, and there was almost no automobile traffic in the upper part of Gibraltar because there's no room for automobiles, but there's still room for cannons. Now, this was a particular invention at the time to get a cannon that could shoot down. There was a certain kind of a packing that could do it, and then aim down, and the shells would not roll out onto the ground. So that's one of the casement cannons, they call them. Then in the town, there's plazas. This is the government center. Now, Gibraltar is independently self-governing, has its own parliament and elected governor, but its foreign policy is still under Whitehall in London. But it has the Gibraltar pound, which is equivalent to the British pound, but is only good in Gibraltar. So if you change any local money and expect to go back to the UK to spend it, it's not accepted, except as a souvenir. Here's the Parliament House. Many a monument to many a warrior sailor, and of course Queen Victoria. So it is very British, and had a referendum in 1998 to stay British. 98.8% of the population voted to stay as a crown colony, much to the consternation of the Spanish. And so you go in some ways it's maybe more British than some parts of Britain anymore. You have a Marks and Spencer and the usual outlets and things in the downtown area. This is the Catholic cathedral, which was the last of the Spanish buildings that has remained, and there are many Catholics there. There are also many Muslims. Now the population of Gibraltar is a very mixed quality. And they're living in fairly modest circumstances because, again, the little lanes go up and the houses are very tightly together. If you want to have a larger house and a car, usually you move over to Spain, which people do. But my usual watering hole is this old pub, catch up on the football. So it's well worth just walking around. And back during the referendum, they had flags everywhere. You can see that's the Gibraltar flag, the red and the white, with the original seal from Queen Isabella and then the Union Jack. So you'll find that, again, it's a very patriotic place. And then you go up the hill. Now, this is almost too steep to hike, so what they have is a cable car. You can go right up to the very top. And this is the way to get a great overlook. And this is one tremendous piece of rock. Again, on the lower left-hand side, you have that water catchment system, and then the town is on the right side, as you see. But if you do nothing else, you can take a local bus or take a tour all the way out to the point of Europa. The remarkable thing about the rock, it's full of water if there's been enough rain. And there are limestone caves with lakes, and then they built reservoirs in there. So one of the key factors for Gibraltar is that it's generally always had enough water for its people, which makes it, let's say, a habitable place these days now that they've made reservoirs. And then on the hillsides, there's a local generic lily called the Gibraltar lily, which is unique to the island. But the most famous resident are these Barbary macaque monkeys that are up on the hillsides, and the tour office was warning everybody, and I'll repeat it, that don't get near them because they are very good pickpockets. And they're not too friendly, and they'll bite, but they've become the symbol of Gibraltar, and the old saying, as long as the monkeys are still on the rock, Gibraltar will remain British, or be in monkey business, whichever it is. Thank you very much. Recently, they've had trouble because many countries have banned the online gambling that was based in Gibraltar. And so yet another battle is ahead of us. And then there's the real estate. So this is the development right near where we're landing. And so, I mean, some of the longtime residents not too happy to see it get a skyline like the rest of what I call the Great Wall of southern Spain, where there's condos for as far as you can see everywhere. But Gibraltar has special tax status, so this is an investment vehicle. And so that's the new town just outside the old town. So I say you can go around there. I'd say buy now before the price goes down again. So it's a great place, very small and very interesting. This is the airport, so we're not going there, but you can see the amount of development and all the rest of the bay. And again, there's a very mixed population. So after all these wars and sieges and people being kicked out and drawn back in, you have a growing Muslim population. And King Fahd of Saudi Arabia donated this mosque as a sign of reconciliation to Gibraltar and for the peace of this particular place and the cooperation with Europe. Now I'm going to leave you with one last image, though. This is a proposal made in the 1920s by a group of German engineers to build a dam across the Strait of Gibraltar. And this was to provide electricity from the flow of the incoming Atlantic water as the Mediterranean sort of evaporates away, and have an autobahn across to develop North Africa with a major link. Now, this is a project that has been discussed in recent times, again, because of rising seas. And so the question is, would that do better than letting how many Mediterranean cities be buried over the next century with too much water, like Venice is almost? And it would, back in the, it's called the Atlantropa project, was to dam at Gibraltar and then let the Mediterranean drop its level enough to have all this new land in red you see, and then have new room for the growing population of Europe. But now it might be considered just to protect all of the Mediterranean basin from inundation, if this is what is really the fate. So I trust that's not necessary. And so here's a painting of, or a faux picture, I'd say, of one of the nobility of the past, wondering why do we have this rock, and I hope that it stays and is not enveloped either in environmental conflict and or political conflict yet again, and will stay a rock of peace. Now this is a little scene of the same place with the new airport, and the modernization of Gibraltar is only possible because of cooperation, and that's the way we hope it will stay. Anyway, I wish you a good visit there. My pleasure to be on the ship, and bon voyage. Thank you.